The courtroom smelled like old paper and disinfectant, like every decision made in that room had already been lived with long before it was spoken out loud. I sat in a chair that felt harder than it needed to be, hands folded in my lap the way my mother taught me when I was a kid and adults were handling business. I was 18 years old, legally grown, emotionally still trying to understand how someone could cut you off without ever raising their voice. My parents sat across from me, side by side, like this was a meeting they'd scheduled weeks ago. My mother wore a soft beige blazer, the kind she reserved for church or school meetings where she wanted to look reasonable, unshakable. My father's suit was dark, pressed too neatly, like control itself had been ironed into the fabric. They didn't look at me, not once. They looked forward, eyes fixed on the judge, calm in a way that felt rehearsed. That calm hurt more than anger ever could have. The judge spoke in a measured tone, reading from documents that used words like severance, independence, no further obligation. Words that sounded more like a business dissolution than a family breaking apart. Each sentence landed flat, unemotional, final. I waited for someone to ask me if I understood what this meant. I waited for someone to pause, to check my face, to acknowledge that I was still a kid standing in front of the people who raised him. No one did. My mother nodded at the appropriate moments, lips pressed together like she was proud of herself for staying composed. My father cleared his throat once, quietly, like that small sound was supposed to stand in for everything he refused to say. They didn't look relieved. They didn't look sad. They looked finished. When the judge said, "That concludes the matter," my chest tightened. That was it. No appeal. No discussion. No space for feelings. My mother slid a thin folder across the table toward the court clerk. Not toward me. The sound of it scraping against the wood was sharp, louder than any voice in the room. It sounded permanent. We stood. Chairs scraped. Papers were gathered. The system moved on like it always does. As we walked past each other, my father leaned in just enough that I could smell his cologne, the same one he wore to every important event, every moment that was supposed to matter. "This is for the best," he said quietly, like he was giving advice, not ending something. "You'll understand one day." I nodded, not because I agreed, because nodding had always been safer than asking questions. Outside, the sunlight hit my face hard, too bright for what had just happened. People moved around the courthouse steps laughing, arguing, checking their phones, living lives untouched by mine unraveling. Someone bumped my shoulder and muttered an apology. I didn't respond. I stood there watching my parents walk away together, their backs straight, steps steady, like they'd just checked something off a list. I felt hollow, not empty, hollow, like something had been scooped out of me with precision. I checked my phone. No messages, no missed calls, nothing from family. It was like the decision in that room had already reached everyone before I did. I sat down on a bench across the street, my hands trembling now that no one was watching. I replayed the courtroom in my head. The wording, the dates on the paperwork, the way my parents didn't hesitate. This hadn't been a reaction. This was something they'd prepared for, planned, agreed on long before they ever told me. That realization settled heavy in my chest. They didn't just cut me off. They came ready. As I sat there, staring at the courthouse doors, one thought kept looping through my mind, refusing to let go. If they were this calm, if they were this confident, then whatever they were protecting mattered more than I ever did. And I didn't know what that was yet. But I knew, deep in my bones, that court wasn't the end of my story. It was the first time I'd finally been forced to look at it clearly. Nobody tells you what to do after court ends and your parents walk away like you were never theirs. I stayed on the courthouse steps long after they disappeared down the sidewalk. I told myself I was just catching my breath, but really I didn't know where to go. There was no next instruction, no adult voice telling me what came after being officially cut loose. The system had done its part. My parents had done theirs. I was 18, legally independent, standing in the heat with a phone that stayed stubbornly quiet in my pocket. I sat on a cold stone bench across the street and watched people come and go. Some walked out arguing, voices sharp with anger. Some cried openly, shoulders shaking as relatives wrapped arms around them. Others laughed, relieved, like whatever they'd been dealing with was finally over. I felt separate from all of it, like I was watching life through thick glass. I checked my phone again. Still nothing. No text from my mother asking if I was okay. No call from my father telling me to get home safe. Not even a message from an aunt or uncle pretending this was about boundaries or tough love. It was like the decision in that room had wiped me clean from the family roster. Eventually, I stood and started walking. I didn't have a destination. My body just needed to move, like staying still would let the weight crush me. Cars rushed past, horns blaring, people late for things that still mattered to them. I wondered if my parents were already discussing lunch plans. Relieved the uncomfortable part was done. By the time I reached the apartment, my legs felt weak. Inside, my roommates were packing boxes for summer break. Their parents were coming that weekend to help move them out. One of them looked up and said, "Hey, man," like nothing had changed. I nodded back and went straight to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall. The quiet was loud here. No court clerk shuffling papers. No judge's voice. Just the hum of the refrigerator and laughter drifting in from the living room. I felt like a guest in my own life, waiting for someone to tell me how long I was allowed to stay. Later that night, texts finally came in. Short ones. "You okay? That's rough, man. Let me know if you need anything." I didn't reply. I didn't know how to explain what had happened without sounding dramatic or weak. Saying my parents cut me off in court felt unreal even to me. Like something that happened to someone else. I scrolled through social media instead. That's when I saw my mother's post. It wasn't about me. Of course it wasn't. It was a vague quote about hard decisions and letting go so others can grow. She'd added a praying hands emoji. Comments poured in underneath. People praising her strength. Telling her how proud they were. Saying things like you did what you had to do and sometimes love means stepping back. My stomach twisted. They already had the story out there. Clean, controlled, carefully framed. I closed the app and dropped my phone onto the bed like it had burned me. That's when the silence shifted. At first, silence feels like punishment. Like you've done something wrong and now you're being made to sit with it. But the longer I lay there, the more I realized this silence wasn't accidental. It was strategic. They weren't giving me space to heal. They were counting on the quiet to do what shouting never could. Make me doubt myself. Make me small. Make me accept their version because it was the only one anyone heard. I rolled onto my side and stared at the floor, memories bubbling up uninvited. Moments I'd brushed past before because survival didn't leave room for questions. Conversations about money that ended too quickly. Promises about support that always came with conditions. The way my parents talked about me in public versus how they spoke to me in private. Something in my chest tightened. Not with anger, but with awareness. This wasn't just about today. This wasn't just about court. This was about control. About keeping the narrative neat. About making sure I left quietly, carrying the shame so they didn't have to. I sat up slowly, heart beating harder now. For the first time since the judge spoke those final words, I felt something other than numbness. Clarity. I stopped asking myself why they did this. Why now? Why so cold? Instead, a new question settled in my mind, heavy and persistent. What are they so sure I'll never look at closely enough to challenge? I didn't know the answer yet, but I knew I wasn't going to stay silent long enough to let them decide it for me. Pain doesn't leave all at once. It thins out, like fog burning off under slow sunlight. And when it does, what's left behind is clarity. Sharp, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. The day after court, I woke up earlier than usual. No alarm. My body snapped awake like it had something urgent to handle. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then the memory hit me all at once. The judge's voice, my mother's nod, my father's quiet certainty. My chest tightened, but the panic didn't come back the way I expected. Instead, there was a stillness in me that felt new. I made coffee I couldn't taste and sat at my desk, staring at my laptop like it might answer questions I didn't know how to ask yet. I wasn't angry. Not really. Anger feels hot and reckless. What I felt was colder, focused. My parents always told the same story about money. How much they sacrificed. How much they poured into me. They repeated it so often that it became background noise, something I accepted without checking. Gratitude had been expected, not verification. Now, alone with nothing but time, I started replaying moments I'd ignored. I remembered asking about a college savings account when I was 15. My father laughed and told me, "You don't need to worry about that yet." I remembered scholarship letters arriving in the mail and my mother insisting she handle the paperwork. I remembered how financial aid meetings always happened without me, even when they were supposedly about my future. At the time, I thought it was normal. Parents taking care of things. Parents knowing best. But memory has a way of changing shape once you stop defending the people in it. I opened my email and started digging. Old inboxes, spam folders, messages I'd never bothered to read closely because they didn't seem important back then. Automated notifications, payment confirmations, generic subject lines that blended into everything else. That's when I saw it. An email from years ago, buried under junk mail and forgotten receipts. It was short, boring even. A confirmation of funds processed under my name. I almost skipped past it until I noticed the destination account. It wasn't mine. I stared at the screen, reading the numbers again and again like they might rearrange themselves if I blinked. My heartbeat picked up. My hands felt clammy. I pulled up another email. Then another. Different dates. Same pattern. Money tied to me. Redirected elsewhere. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. It was consistent. Repeated. Deliberate. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, trying to keep my breathing steady. For a moment, I felt like I might throw up. Not from fear, from the realization that something I'd trusted without question had been quietly moved behind my back. I thought about court, about how calm my parents had been, how confident, how prepared. Of course they were. They believed I didn't know enough to connect any of this. That hurt, but it also lit something in me. I started a folder on my laptop and named it nothing. Just a blank space, like I wasn't ready to label what it would become. I dragged the emails into it carefully, one by one, like I was handling something fragile. As I worked, more memories surfaced. The way my parents shut down certain questions. The way they redirected conversations when I asked for specifics. The way money was always discussed in broad terms, "We've got it covered, don't worry about that, focus on school," but never with numbers. I confused control for care. That realization stung worse than anything they'd said in court. I sat there for a long time, staring at the folder, feeling the shift inside me. I wasn't shaking anymore. I wasn't doubting myself. The fog had lifted just enough for me to see shapes forming. I didn't rush to confront them. I didn't call anyone. I didn't post anything. I did what they never expected. I stayed quiet and kept looking. Because now I understood something crucial. This wasn't about proving them wrong emotionally. This was about truth. And truth doesn't need to yell. It just needs to be seen. Truth doesn't show up all at once. It arrives in pieces, waiting to see if you're steady enough to hold it. After finding those emails, I didn't sleep much. My mind kept looping through numbers and dates, replaying my parents' voices over them, trying to understand how two versions of reality had lived side by side for so long. By morning, I wasn't panicked anymore. I was careful. Carefulness felt like power. I spent the day doing something my parents never taught me to do. Ask questions without asking permission. I started with official channels, financial aid offices, scholarship administrators, places that dealt in records instead of opinions. My messages were polite, neutral, almost boring. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I just asked for copies, confirmations, clarification. While I waited, I went through old paperwork stored in a box under my bed. Stuff I'd hauled from house to house without ever opening because I trusted that someone else had already handled it. Tax forms, enrollment letters, statements I'd signed without fully understanding. My signature looked smaller on those pages, like it hadn't yet learned how to take up space. Hours passed. Then responses started coming in. Some offices sent automated replies first. Others took a little longer. But eventually, files began to land in my inbox, one by one, each one filling in another blank space. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time. Funds that were listed under my name hadn't disappeared. They'd been rerouted, consistently, neatly, always with justification language attached. Family discretion, educational management, guardian decision, legal phrases, clean phrases, the kind that sound harmless if you don't read them closely. But I was reading closely now. The numbers lined up with the emails I'd found earlier. Different sources. Same outcome. Money intended for me had been redirected elsewhere year after year. Not randomly. With intention. I leaned back in my chair, my heart pounding in my ears. My first instinct was to pick up my phone and call my parents. Demand answers. Hear them explain. But that instinct faded as quickly as it came. Because explanations weren't what I needed anymore. Proof was. I created another folder. This one I named Records. I organized everything by date, source, and amount. I highlighted inconsistencies. Made notes in the margins like a student preparing for an exam. As I worked, the emotional weight shifted. The hurt was still there, sitting heavy in my chest, but it wasn't in control anymore. It was background noise. What mattered now was precision. One document in particular made my hands freeze on the keyboard. It listed a disbursement date that didn't match my parents' testimony in court. They'd claimed certain funds never existed. This paper said otherwise, clearly, officially, without emotion. I read that line over and over until it burned into my mind. This wasn't just about being cut off. This was about misrepresentation. And misrepresentation, when documented, carries consequences. I closed my laptop and stared at the wall, feeling the gravity of what I was holding. Not leverage, not revenge, responsibility. Once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. And you don't get to pretend it doesn't matter just because confronting it is uncomfortable. I thought about the way my parents had looked walking out of court. Confident, unbothered, certain that this chapter was closed. They believed the system had protected them. That paperwork worked in their favor. They were half right. Paperwork does protect people. Just not always the ones who think they control it. That night, as I added one final document to the folder, something settled inside me. Calm I hadn't felt before. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't ungrateful. I wasn't dramatic. I was holding the first solid piece of truth no one could talk around. The first receipt. And I understood, for the first time, that silence had been their weapon. But now it was becoming mine. There's a strange kind of grief that comes from realizing the people who hurt you are admired by everyone else. Once I had the records, I started noticing things I'd ignored my whole life. Not because they were hidden, but because I wasn't allowed to question them. My parents' public image had always been clean, respected. People spoke about them with admiration, the kind that assumes sacrifice without ever asking for proof. I saw it everywhere once I started looking. Old posts on social media praising their generosity. Community newsletters thanking them for supporting youth. Church announcements calling them pillars and mentors. Every compliment felt heavier now, like it was resting on a foundation that hadn't been inspected closely enough. I used to feel proud reading those words. Now they felt like a mask. A carefully shaped version of my parents that existed outside our house. One where they were endlessly patient, endlessly giving, endlessly right. That version of them never raised voices. Never redirected funds. Never treated love like leverage. I remembered how different things felt at home. How conversations about money always came with disclaimers. How gratitude was expected before questions. How silence was rewarded and curiosity punished. Seeing the contrast made something inside me tighten. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't comment on posts or correct stories. I just watched, listened, learned how easily people accepted the version of my parents that was offered to them. One afternoon, I ran into a family friend at a grocery store. She smiled wide when she saw me. "You're so lucky," she said. shaking her head. Your parents did everything right with you. I tell my kids all the time to be grateful like you are. I felt my mouth form a smile before I could stop it. A reflex. Years of practice. Yeah, I said softly. She went on talking, praising them, listing sacrifices I now knew didn't line up with reality. I nodded in all the right places, my chest aching with the effort of holding two truths at once. The one she believed and the one I lived. When I got back to my apartment, I sat on my bed and let the mask settle in my lap. Not theirs. Mine. I realized something then that scared me more than court ever had. They hadn't just controlled resources. They'd controlled the narrative. And they were good at it. I opened my folders again and reviewed everything. Dates, amounts, statements. The contrast between what they said and what they did was undeniable when placed side by side. But I understood now why they'd been so confident. Most people never ask for receipts. They trust tone, reputation, familiar faces. That realization changed how I moved. I stopped expecting validation from anyone who hadn't seen the records. I stopped craving understanding from people invested in the lie. Instead, I focused on something quieter: consistency. Truth doesn't need applause. It needs time. A few days later, something unexpected happened. At a small gathering I hadn't planned on attending, someone mentioned a detail casually. A date, a conversation, a financial claim that matched what I'd seen in the paperwork, not what my parents had told the court. They didn't even realize what they were confirming. I stayed still, listened carefully, asked neutral questions, let them talk. By the time I left, my hands were steady and my thoughts clear. I had my first witness, not someone ready to testify, not someone trying to help, someone who simply didn't know they were holding a piece of the truth. That night, as I added a note to my folder, I understood something important. The mask my parents wore didn't crack all at once. Cracked in quiet rooms, in passing comments, in the space between what people assumed and what records showed. And for the first time since court, I felt something close to control. Not over them, over myself. Because I wasn't chasing exposure anymore. I was letting the truth assemble itself. Patiently, completely, until it could stand on its own without my anger holding it up. Help didn't come from where I thought it would. It didn't arrive with a hug or a speech or someone telling me everything was going to be okay. It came quietly, dressed like routine, hiding inside a conversation that was supposed to be nothing more than procedural. I'd made an appointment with a legal aid office mostly to ask questions. Not to accuse anyone. Not to start a case. I told myself I just needed to understand what I was looking at. The documents, the language, the implications. Knowledge felt safer than action. I wasn't ready for action yet. The waiting room was small, beige walls covered in flyers about tenant rights and student loans. People sat spaced apart, eyes down, each carrying their own version of quiet desperation. I fit right in. I took a number and sat, my folder heavy in my backpack like it had its own gravity. When my name was called, I followed a woman into a modest office. She didn't smile too wide, didn't soften her voice. She just gestured for me to sit and asked, "What can I help you understand today?" That phrasing mattered. I explained the situation slowly. My parents, court, being cut off. I didn't dramatize it. I'd learned that emotion sometimes made people stop listening. I laid out the facts instead. Dates, claims, documents. I handed her the folder. She skimmed at first, eyes moving quickly. Then she slowed down. Her pen paused on the page. She went back. Read again. I watched her face carefully, expecting some reaction. Shock, sympathy, concern. Instead, her expression stayed neutral, focused. That scared me more than anything else. "Did anyone explain this line to you?" she asked, pointing to a paragraph halfway down a page. I shook my head. She turned the document toward me. "This contradicts what you're describing your parents said in court." The room felt smaller all of a sudden. I leaned forward, reading the sentence again. I'd seen it before, highlighted it even, but hearing someone else say it out loud, hearing it framed as a contradiction, not a suspicion, made my chest tighten. "Is that Serious? I asked. She didn't answer right away. She flipped through more pages, cross-referencing dates, signatures, filing numbers. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't dramatic. She was thorough. Finally, she looked up at me. It matters, she said, because this isn't about misunderstanding. It's about representation. Representation. The word landed heavy. She explained what it meant in calm, measured terms. How sworn statements worked. How intent was evaluated. How records didn't need emotion to be valid. They needed consistency. As she spoke, something shifted inside me. Not excitement. Not triumph. Relief. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't reading too much into things. I wasn't a kid looking for excuses. This was real. She didn't promise me anything. Didn't say we'd take them down or make things right. She just outlined options. What could be requested? What could be reviewed? What timelines looked like? When the meeting ended, she handed the folder back to me, tapping it once. Keep everything, she said, and don't discuss this with anyone who benefits from you staying confused. That sentence stayed with me long after I left the office. Outside, the air felt different, not lighter, clearer, like the fog had thinned enough for me to see where I was standing. I walked for a long time after that, past places I'd been before, but never noticed. I replayed her words in my head, especially the way she'd said representation. My parents hadn't just made decisions for me. They'd spoken for me, and they'd done it in ways that didn't align with the record. That night, I opened my folders again and added notes. Not emotional ones, strategic ones, questions to answer, connections to verify. I realized something important then. Up until now, I'd been reacting. Now I was preparing. I wasn't alone in this anymore. Not because someone was fighting for me, but because someone had confirmed what I already felt in my gut. The truth wasn't fragile. It didn't need protection. It just needed to be placed in the right light. And once it was, there would be no pretending it wasn't there. Lies don't fall apart all at once. They unravel when time stops cooperating. After meeting with legal aid, I stopped seeing the documents as separate pieces. They weren't random anymore. They were a timeline, one my parents never expected me to line up. Every date, every signature, every justification phrase suddenly mattered in a way it hadn't before. I printed everything out and spread it across my desk. Papers overlapped, edges curling, highlighter marks catching the light. It looked chaotic at first, but the more I studied it, the clearer the pattern became. My parents' story depended on memory, on what people felt had happened, on authority and tone and reputation. The records depended on dates. And dates don't forget. I started at the beginning, the earliest instance of redirected funds. I traced it forward year by year, noting when conversations at home changed, when certain promises stopped being discussed, when phrases like "we've handled it" replaced actual answers. The gaps told their own story. I realized something that made my hands go cold. The first redirection happened right after a public event where my parents were praised for supporting my education. The timing was too precise to ignore. Their generosity was being spoken about at the exact moment the resources tied to me were being quietly moved elsewhere. That wasn't coincidence. That was coordination. I thought back to the courtroom, to how confident my parents had sounded when they claimed certain funds never existed. How easily they said it. How natural the lie felt coming from them. It worked because no one had challenged the timeline. Until now. I lined up the court transcript summary with the records. One line jumped out immediately. A sworn statement about a date that simply didn't match reality. They'd said something happened in a year when the paperwork proved it couldn't have. I circled it hard enough to tear the paper. My chest tightened, but I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity sharpen into resolve. This was bigger than being cut off. This was about credibility. I realized then why they'd been so eager to finalize everything quickly in court. Why there was no discussion, no hesitation. Speed favors people who need fewer questions asked. I slowed everything down. I created a clean timeline, rewriting events in chronological order, stripping out emotion, leaving only facts. When I finished, The contradiction sat there plainly, undeniable. It wasn't hidden. It was exposed by alignment. I leaned back in my chair, heart beating steady and strong. For the first time since court, I felt taller. Not physically, internally. Like I wasn't shrinking to fit someone else's version of me anymore. A memory surfaced then. My father once telling me, "Details don't matter. People remember how you make them feel." He was wrong. Details matter when feelings fade. That night, I organized everything into a single packet. I didn't add commentary. I didn't add accusations. I let the documents speak. As I slid the papers into a folder, I felt the weight of what I was holding. Not vengeance, not leverage, truth. And truth has a quiet gravity to it. It pulls things into alignment whether people want it to or not. I knew then that the system my parents trusted, the one they believed protected them, was the same system that would expose them. All it needed was for someone to connect the dots. And that someone was me. I closed the folder and turned off the light, my mind calm in a way that surprised me. There was nothing left to chase. No one left to convince. The timeline had collapsed their story. And the next step wasn't about confrontation. It was about record. Once the truth entered the record, it wouldn't matter how loud they'd been before. Silence was about to change sides. There's a moment when truth stops feeling like information and starts feeling like gravity. I didn't rush into anything after the timeline came together. I let it sit. Let myself sit with it. I needed to be sure I wasn't reacting from hurt or ego. This wasn't about proving my parents wrong in an argument. This was about placing something undeniable where it belonged. In the record, I submitted the packet the way I'd been advised to, quietly, cleanly, without commentary. No accusations, no emotional framing, just documents aligned and labeled, each one reinforcing the same point from a different angle. Dates, signatures, statements. The contradiction threaded through all of it like a seam you couldn't unpick. When the day came for the review, I walked into the building alone. No parents beside me, no advocate holding my hand. Just a folder under my arm and a calm I didn't recognize as my own until I felt it settle in my chest. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't hopeful. I was ready. They were already there. My parents sat across the room again. Same posture as before, same controlled stillness. My mother's face was neutral. Her mouth set in that familiar line she used when she believed she was being reasonable. My father avoided my eyes, flipping through papers like he was checking to see if anything had changed. Something had. The official handling the review didn't start with emotion. They started with sequence. They asked clarifying questions, requested confirmation of dates, compared records. Each step was methodical, slow enough to feel uncomfortable. I watched my parents' confidence flicker, just slightly, when a document was turned toward them instead of away. "This filing," the official said, tapping the page, "does not align with the statement provided previously." The room went quiet. Not dramatic quiet, procedural quiet, the kind that doesn't allow interruptions. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. My father cleared his throat, just like he had in court weeks earlier. But this time, no one moved on for him. The official continued. "This signature appears on both documents. The dates differ. The explanation provided does not account for the discrepancy." I felt my pulse steady. They weren't being accused. They were being questioned. That distinction mattered. My parents tried to reframe, tried to soften language, tried to explain intent without addressing the contradiction directly. They spoke carefully, choosing words they'd relied on for years. But words don't override paper. The official didn't raise their voice, didn't push back emotionally. They just pointed again calmly to the same line, the same date, the same signature. "That doesn't resolve the inconsistency," they said. And that was it. That was the moment. I saw it in my parents' faces, the shift. Not fear. Something quieter. The realization that the room no longer belonged to them. That their authority had stalled. For the first time in my life, they didn't have the final word. Silence stretched. Not the silence of punishment. The silence of recalibration. The kind that forces people to realize they're not in control of the narrative anymore. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Everything I needed to say was already on the table, printed in black ink, dated, signed, undeniable. The official closed the folder slowly. "This will need to be addressed," they said. "The record will reflect the discrepancy." Record. That word echoed in my chest. My parents nodded stiffly. They didn't look at me as we stood to leave. They gathered their things with hands that moved just a little too fast. Outside, the air felt different again, heavier but honest. I stood there for a moment, watching them walk away without a word. No lecture. No warning. No attempt to reassert control. They didn't chase me. They couldn't. Because something had changed that couldn't be undone. The truth wasn't a secret anymore. It was official. And no matter how much power they'd held over me before, no matter how carefully they'd shaped the story, there was one thing they could never deny now. Their own signatures had spoken, and the record would remember it long after everyone stopped pretending nothing had happened. Control doesn't shatter when it breaks. It loosens, quietly, like a grip you didn't realize was tight until it starts to let go. After the review, nothing dramatic happened. No public fallout. No apologies. No phone calls in the middle of the night. The world didn't stop spinning just because the truth had entered the record. That's how I knew it mattered. Power rarely announces its loss. I started noticing small shifts first. People who used to speak confidently about my parents now spoke more carefully. Their names still carried respect, but the certainty around them softened. Conversations paused where they hadn't before. Phrases like "I'm not sure" and "I might be mistaken" began to slip into places where authority used to stand firm. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't have to. The story was changing on its own. I ran into my father once outside a building we'd both visited countless times when I was younger. He looked older somehow. Not physically, structurally. Like something in him had bent and never quite snapped back. He nodded at me. A small, contained gesture. Not an invitation. Not a dismissal. I nodded back. That was all. No lecture. No warning about consequences. No reminder of what I owed them. The script they'd used my whole life no longer applied, and neither of us pretended otherwise. That was the moment I understood something important. They hadn't lost everything. They'd lost control over me, and that loss mattered more than any punishment ever could. In the weeks that followed, things continued to settle. Official processes moved slowly, deliberately. I wasn't dragged back into court. I wasn't interrogated. My parents weren't publicly shamed. The record simply existed. And existence was enough. I thought often about how much energy I'd spent growing up trying to anticipate my parents' reactions, measuring my words, adjusting my behavior, bracing for disappointment or withdrawal. That constant vigilance had shaped who I was without me realizing it. Now that tension was gone. I slept better. Not longer but deeper. Like my body finally understood it didn't need to stay alert anymore. I started making plans that didn't involve anyone else's approval. Small ones at first. A job interview. A change in living arrangements. Practical steps toward a future that belonged to me, not a version of me someone else managed. Every once in a while, guilt tried to creep back in. They're still your parents. You didn't have to go this far. Maybe this wasn't worth it. But then I remembered the calm in the courtroom. The certainty. The way they'd slid that folder across the table like my life was a transaction they were done negotiating. I hadn't gone far. I'd gone accurate. There's a difference. I realized then that revenge doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like separation. Like refusing to carry what was never yours to begin with. My parents still existed in the world. Still spoke. Still attended events. Still smiled for photos. But their power over me was gone. They no longer defined who I was, what I owed, or how small I needed to be to belong. I walked through my days lighter, not because everything was easy, but because nothing was being hidden anymore. I wasn't protecting anyone else's image at the expense of my own. That freedom felt quiet, earned, and irreversible. I didn't need closure from them. I didn't need forgiveness or validation. I didn't need to hear them admit what they'd done. The record had done that for me. And as control continued to slip from their hands, piece by piece, I understood something that would stay with me long after this chapter closed. Power isn't taken by force. It's lost when truth makes it unnecessary. And once it's gone, it doesn't come back the same way again. They cut me off like they were closing a file. What they didn't realize was that they were also closing a door. One I'd been standing behind my entire life, waiting for permission to open. After everything settled, after the records were updated and the tension stopped humming in the background of every room, I expected to feel something bigger. Relief, triumph, maybe even grief. People talk about closure like it arrives with ceremony, like a final conversation or a mutual understanding. That's not how it happened for me. It happened quietly. One morning, I woke up and realized I hadn't thought about my parents in days. Not with anger, not with fear, not with that tight feeling in my chest that used to show up every time my phone buzzed. Just absence. And absence, I learned, can be peaceful when it's chosen. I moved forward in small, deliberate steps. I worked. I saved. I learned how to ask questions without apologizing for them. How to read documents all the way through. How to trust my instincts when something didn't feel right instead of dismissing that feeling as disrespect. I stopped explaining myself to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. Some family members drifted away. Others stayed at a distance, unsure of where to place me now that the story had changed. I didn't chase any of them. I wasn't trying to rebuild a version of family that only worked when I stayed quiet. The truth had done its work. Not loudly, not publicly, but thoroughly. Every now and then, I'd hear updates about my parents through other people. Nothing dramatic, just small shifts, less certainty, more careful wording, a sense that something had changed, even if no one named it out loud. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing those things. I felt done. That surprised me. For a long time, I thought revenge meant watching someone else hurt the way you did. But that kind of thinking keeps you tied to the same pain, just from the opposite side. What I felt instead was separation, the clean kind. The kind that lets you breathe without checking over your shoulder. I'd spent my childhood believing love meant access. That obedience was proof of gratitude. That silence was maturity. I know better now. Love doesn't require erasure. Support doesn't fear transparency. And family shouldn't need control to survive. What I walked away with wasn't money or apologies or restored relationships. I walked away with my name intact. With my story no longer filtered through someone else's comfort. With the understanding that truth doesn't need an audience to matter, it just needs to exist. Sometimes I think back to that day in court, to the way my parents slid that folder across the table, confident they were ending something on their terms. They believed they were cutting me loose, forcing me to learn independence the hard way. In a way, they were right. They just didn't realize independence would mean freedom from them. I don't wish them harm. I don't rehearse speeches in my head or imagine alternate endings where they apologize and finally see me clearly. That chapter doesn't need revision. The record speaks. And so do I now when it matters and only to people who listen. My life didn't get louder after that. It got quieter, steadier. Mine.